So can you tell us who you are, where you went to school, and what you're doing at RIT?
Okay. My name is Kristoffer Whitney. My PhD is in the history and sociology of science from the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm here as an assistant professor in the Science, Technology, and Society Department.
Okay. What is the topic of your research?
Most of my research is on endangered species science and policy. And since we're talking about case studies, the specific case study that I use is centers around the horseshoe crab fishery in the Delaware Bay and its effect on migratory bird populations.
Okay. Are there any specific case studies that you've worked on and published recently?
I've published a handful of articles based on that case study, based on the horseshoe crab fishery and the shorebirds.
And how did you get into the area of study?
As part of my PhD program at Penn, I had to choose what I wanted to do my dissertation on, and I had lived on the Delaware Bay for about 4 years prior to going to grad school in Philly. And so I decided that it was sort of a hot political issue at the time, so I decided I would take a close look at that one case as a window into larger issues about endangered species and science and policy.
And you would describe your approach as case study research?
I would.
Okay.
Yes.
Have you ever used any other methods of research in the past?
Yes, maybe. I think I describe what I do as a case study because I take a very close look at a very specific set of events with a very bounded number of people, bounded time frame, bounded kinds of sources. I think that said, I think case study is a very fuzzy. There's no firm boundary between what is a case study and what is something else. Everything you could say everything is a case study really, because nobody, no matter what kind of method they're using, is looking at everything everywhere all the time. You have to bound your study in some way. I just think that most things get called case studies because they're looking at something with a particularly small set of boundaries, hoping that if you know one system very well, one case very well, you can compare it to other cases, and the ability to generalize, if you want to do that, comes from being able to compare your case with all the other cases that other people doing similar things have done. That's a long way to say I've done other work that's more broadly historical, where I wouldn't. So, for example, I have a historical paper on the history of lawns in the U.S. And because I'm talking about this sort of ubiquitous landscape across the whole country over decades and decades, using a variety of different sources, most of them historical archives and publications, I wouldn't consider that really a case study in the same way that looking at this one political and scientific issue in this one place, I very much consider a case study.
Okay, so what made you choose to continue with case study research as opposed to something else?
I think what I like about case study research is that you can actually incorporate any other method you want to into it. So because I've chosen this one thing to look very, very closely at, I can and have used ethnographic methods, participant observation, interviews, things like that. I can and have used historical methods, looking at historical documentation on sort of the history of environmental science and endangered species policies as applied to this one case study. If one wanted to, even though I don't do this, one could apply quantitative methods to a case study as well.
So how were you trained in the case study approach?
I wasn't. I think most people in coming out of my department in grad school are historians, with a smattering of people like me who do both history and sociology. Again, micro sort of qualitative sociology. And depending on, it almost comes down to topic. People who want to do certain topics are almost forced to take a broader approach to what they're doing, whereas I decided to do the opposite. I wanted to take a very, very narrow approach to this one thing and see what, looking that closely at this one case, might tell me about similar cases elsewhere. So I was never told to do that or taught to do that specifically. Again, I think the value of the case study approach is that you can bring a lot of methods to bear on your case. And so I was given tools, sort of intellectual and practical tools, in several different methods, and I applied those methods to this one case.
And I think you've kind of hit on this already, but what do you think that case study approach offers that others don't?
I think aside from what I mentioned before about getting to use a lot of different methods and taking a different tack in terms of generalizable knowledge, if that's even of interest to the person doing the research. I think that what the case study approach, I think maybe one of the biggest attractions to the case study approach is it can be so very interesting. You get to know something really, really well and intimately, and you get to know the people who are involved in the history of it in a very careful, close way, which is not the case, which would be the case if you wanted to do, say, a statistical or demographic analysis of, pick a phenomenon across a country or a continent or the globe. There's nothing wrong with doing those kinds of studies, but I find case studies just so much more interesting, so much more fun.
What are some challenges that you've encountered with the case study approach?
The biggest challenge with the case study approach, well, I guess there are two. One is you could decide that you want to study this one system, this one group of people, or this one issue really closely, and then hit a dead end. If people don't want to talk to you, if it's too controversial, if you can't find enough source material, well, then you've invested all this time in this one thing, and you can't do that thing. And occasionally you find people who started a project like that and just couldn't finish and didn't know what to do. The other problem you might have with a case study approach is epistemological. You might run into people from other disciplines or who think about knowledge differently, who simply don't buy the case study approach as a way to know something. If you are trying to generalize from this one specific case, there may be people that will say, okay, you know about red knots and horseshoe crabs really well, but what does that have to do with knowing about these other endangered species or organisms or these other political controversies about environmental science? So that's sort of an intellectual wall you can hit sometimes.
Okay, so another question that we had that was more to do with your specific research that you're doing, would you consider it more holistic or embedded?
That's an interesting question. I mean, a case study has to be embedded in the sense that you're looking at one very bounded thing in a larger system, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm looking at these endangered shorebirds and horseshoe crab fishery. Well, those two species are embedded in a much larger system of the Endangered Species Act and fishery regulations and all these things. So it has to be embedded. But I would argue it's also holistic at the same time, in the sense that you're not knowing this issue in one way statistically, or just through a survey, or just through interviews, or just through historical documentation. You're knowing it in all those ways. So I'm not going to answer your question. I'm not going to pick one. I'm going to say it's both.
Okay. Another thing that we were kind of just wondering, what kind of data do you prefer to use when you're studying things?
Well, all qualitative, but that's why you're in this class. I enjoy working with live people. So I enjoy interviewing. I enjoy participant observation. I went out, for instance, with a bunch of shorebird biologists to help catch and tag birds. So I enjoy that kind of, I enjoy gathering that kind of data, even if it's sort of hard to, it might be difficult to interpret sometimes. I also enjoy the historical work, sitting in an archive and digging up old letters and documents.
Yes.
So both. They both have their pluses and minuses. It's a lot harder to work with or a lot easier to work with dead people in some ways, because they don't talk back. You just read what they wrote.
So do you have any suggestions for students who are starting in research and are interested in case study?
I think a case study is the obvious way to start learning how to do research, because of its bounded nature, you can get a handle on an issue or system or whatever it is relatively quickly, and you can get a handle on it from multiple perspectives. So I would advise anybody starting research to start with a case study or something like a case study. If you're going to start doing research on a really large issue, you're going to sort of flail and trying to figure out where to even start and what kind of data to use. So I think a case study is the way to start learning how to research, and then you can always build from there. You can always develop a comparative case where you're doing multiple case studies that have something to do with each other.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any other questions? Do you have any other information that you think that we didn't hit on that you find particularly important in your research?
No, I think those are excellent questions. I think we hit everything.
Okay.